Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thanks for having me back.
Oh, absolutely. So imagine locking a murderer in his room for an entire weekend.
Just locking him in.
Yeah, locking him in to force him to detox cold turkey. And the only person who can actually calm him down is an old woman with a teapot.
Right, which sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. But today, we are actually looking at how grassroots workers fought raw urban terror. We are doing a deep dive into the source material from Phyllis Thompson's book, To the Heart of the City, The Story of the London City Mission.
Which is just a fascinating text.
It is. Our goal here is to trace this 150-year evolution of urban poverty, social reform, and honestly, sheer human resilience in one of the world's greatest metropolises.
London.
Right. We want to look at how the actual anatomy of a city's suffering changes over time. Like, how does a city transition from raw physical destitution to this really complex psychological isolation?
And how do the people on the ground adapt to those shifting needs, right?
Exactly.
It is a profound shift to trace, truly. To really set the scene for this deep dive, we have to look at what the London City Mission, the LCM, actually is.
Because it's not what people might think today.
No. Not at all. If you travel through modern London today, you might see their impressive headquarters near Tower Bridge. It's concrete, steel, very permanent.
Yeah, a massive corporate building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Thompson's book opens with a completely different framework. She calls the mission an invisible building made of living stones.
Living stones. I love that imagery.
Right. They aren't structural bricks. They are people. People who have been pulled from the deepest quarries and the darkest mines of London over a century and a half.
So it's a living infrastructure.
Exactly. The story we have in front of us is about the men and women who went down into the dark to chisel away and find those living stones.
The idea of a city not as architecture, but as an invisible human infrastructure just changes everything. You stop looking at the buildings and start looking at the gaps between them.
That's a great way to put it.
And to figure out who engineered this invisible building, the sources actually take us back to 1826, to a man named David Nasmith.
Oh, Nasmith, yes.
The texts describe a guy who essentially had organizational flowcharts running through his veins.
He really did.
He was a 36-year-old former clerk in Glasgow, Scotland. And at one point, he was acting as the assistant secretary for 23 different religious societies.
At the exact same time.
Wait, 23? At once?
Yes. He was basically a central processing unit for 19th century philanthropy.
That is insane. How do you even manage that?
These various societies hired him to consolidate their office work and save money, right? So Nasmith is sitting there balancing the books, managing the correspondence for dozens of groups.
So he sees the whole matrix.
Exactly. He gets a panoramic view of how British religion and charity actually operate on a systemic level. And what he sees is a massive gaping hole in the strategy.
Okay, let's unpack this. What was the hole?
He realizes that the conventional approach, which was sending university-trained middle-class or aristocratic clergy into the slums, is a total, utter failure.
Because it's essentially two different planets trying to communicate, right?
Completely.
We have the Industrial Revolution pulling hundreds of thousands of people from agrarian lives into these crammed, unregulated urban centers.
Yeah, London was just exploding in population.
And the institutional church had no idea how to handle it. You had highly educated men trying to preach abstract theology to people who were literally starving in the mud.
Exactly. The slum dwellers didn't go to the institutional churches, And even if they did, they literally wouldn't understand the academic, high English vocabulary of the pulpit.
It was basically a foreign language.
Right. The language of the streets was entirely different. So Nasmith's radical solution in 1826 was to bypass the clergy entirely.
Which was huge back then.
Oh, massive. He proposed using ordinary working-class laymen to reach the slums. Men who had worked the docks, heaved coal, or swept the streets.
I feel like a modern listener might just shrug at that and say, well, yeah, use relatable people.
Sure. It sounds like common sense now.
But in the 1820s, British religion was rigidly hierarchical, right?
Very rigid.
You had the established Church of England on one side and the dissenters, the Protestants who broke away from the state church like the Baptists or Methodists on the other. And they hated each other.
I really did not mix.
And above all of them was this massive gulf separating anyone with formal education from the working poor.
Right. The class divide was absolute.
Suggesting that a guy who used to shovel coal could be an official spiritual guide seems like it would have offended basically everyone in power.
Oh, it offended them deeply. It challenged the entire monopoly on theological authority.
I bet.
But Nasmith recognized that the urban poor needed missionaries just as urgently as any uncontacted society overseas did. They needed someone who could meet them in their own environment.
Someone who could sit on a broken chair in a pub, right?
Exactly. Sit on a broken chair and explain concepts using everyday, gritty metaphors. And despite all the friction, his concept actually worked.
It did. He launched the Glasgow City Mission first.
Yeah, and its success turned him into a serial founder. He didn't just stop in Scotland. He traveled to Dublin, Paris, New York, Canada.
Wait, New York and Canada too?
Yeah, the records show he visited over 120 cities in America and Canada alone, just relentlessly setting up these city missions.
He sounds manic, just a machine of institutional creation.
He kind of was.
Uh-huh.
But eventually, his wife steps in.
Oh, thank goodness for the wife.
Right. She essentially says, we need to live somewhere permanently. And she picks London.
Okay, so they head to London.
So in 1835, Nasmith arrives in London to plant the London City Mission. And he hits an absolute brick wall of establishment pushback.
From the bishops.
Oh, yeah. The Bishop of London actively opposes him. The religious elite tell him that Anglicans and dissenters will never, ever cooperate on a joint committee.
But Nasmith being Nasmith.
She just ignores them. He grabs two friends. They kneel in a tiny 4-room cottage by a canal in Hoxton, and they just officially declare the LCM into existence.
That is some relentless startup founder energy right there.
It really is. But that same energy became a massive liability once the organization started growing.
How so?
Well, the LCM moves into a headquarters in Red Lion Square. They start getting donations. They gain a bit of traction. But Nasmith can't turn off the founder instinct.
He keeps making new things.
Yes. He just keeps creating new adjacent societies under the exact same roof. He spins up a monthly tract society, a young men's association, a reading room, an adult school society.
Wow. It's scope creep on a catastrophic scale.
Totally. The committee is watching their core funding dry up because Nasmith is diluting his focus across a dozen side projects.
And then there's the big scandal.
Oh, the scandal. Yes, it culminates in a massive controversy for the era. Nasmith forms a rescue mission aimed at helping prostitutes, which he calls the Female Friend Society.
Which is a noble goal.
It is. But instead of locating it somewhere discreet, he sets it up right next door to the LCM offices.
Oh, no.
In fact, they are connected by an internal door.
Oh, wow. In the 1830s, Victorian sensibilities, having an internal door between an office of respectable religious men and a rescue home for prostitutes.
Yeah, you can imagine.
The committee must have completely melted down over the optics of that.
They absolutely panicked. The, quote, indelicacy of the arrangement caused public interest to plummet. Key committee members started resigning in protest.
They were jumping ship.
Exactly. It became glaringly obvious that Nasmith's chaotic management style was going to bankrupt and destroy the London City Mission.
So what happened?
In 1837, barely 2 years after he founded the organization, he is forced out. He has to resign.
Wait, looking at the timeline, did Nasmith actually need to be fired for the London City Mission to survive?
That is exactly the dynamic.
Because it sounds like he was an incredible visionary, but a deeply toxic CEO for long-term stability.
That's a perfect way to phrase it. Nasmith was the spark required to ignite the movement. But a spark will burn the entire house down if you don't quickly build a hearth to contain it.
Right, you need boundaries.
By removing Nasmith, the committee was finally able to establish rigid administrative boundaries. They restored the fragile political balance between the Anglicans and the dissenters on the board.
And I assume they moved the Female Friend Society.
They quietly relocated it, yes. Nasmith went right back to founding other disparate societies until his sudden death in 1839. But his departure allowed the LCM to institutionalize.
To focus on the actual ground war.
Yes, the ground war.
And the ground war was horrific. I mean, we are talking about the literal Dickensian era.
It really was.
To understand what these first working-class missionaries walked into, you have to picture the slums of Spitalfields.
Just absolute squalor.
The texts describe a missionary named Lindsay Burfoot being sent in for a salary of £1 a week.
£1.
Right. And he doesn't walk down paved streets. He wades through deep, miry gullies between crumbling, rotting houses.
The infrastructure didn't exist.
And the atmosphere is choked with putrid smells. He has to physically hide his pocket watch and his handkerchief because the local children are systematically trained to strip visitors of their valuables in seconds.
It was an industry of theft, and the attrition rate for these early workers was staggering.
I can imagine.
Out of the first 10 men appointed, 7 quit within the first 2 years.
7 out of 10. Wow.
The environment just broke them. They contracted typhus and cholera from the fever-ridden rooms. They were physically assaulted by pimps and criminals.
It's a combat zone.
Or they just suffered nervous breakdowns from the ceaseless screaming, the violence, and the hostility.
So who actually survived?
The men who managed to survive, like Burfoot, quickly realized a core truth about urban poverty.
Which is?
You cannot preach spiritual salvation to someone who is currently drowning in physical squalor. The two are inextricably linked.
There is a specific narrative in the sources that nails this reality. It happens in an area called Paradise Court.
Oh, Paradise Court.
Which has to be the darkest, ironic naming in London's history.
Absolutely.
A newly appointed, very inexperienced missionary is sent in. He walks into a tenement and starts knocking on doors. Top floor. 6 angry cobblers scream at him to get out.
Not a warm welcome.
No. He goes down a floor. 2nd room. There is a dead child lying on the floor, a mother and daughter burning up with fever in the bed, and the father isn't even there.
Because he's out begging.
Right. He's on the street singing to beg for enough pennies just to bury the dead child.
It's just crushing despair.
It gets worse. He goes to the next room. An old woman is frying fish that is so far gone, so rotten, the smell literally makes him reel backward.
So he's hitting a breaking point.
He is entirely overwhelmed and ready to walk away, but then he hears singing.
He follows the sound.
Yes, and he finds Widow Peters. She is in her 70s, sitting with 4 other elderly women reading a Bible. She looks at him and says she has been praying for a missionary to be sent to Paradise Court.
And she has this incredible tool.
I cannot get over Widow Peters and the teapot. The text notes that she wields this incredibly specific tool, a teapot.
It's brilliant.
She navigates this literal hellscape with a teapot wrapped in her apron to keep the heat in. She just moves from room to room, dispensing hot tea to hysterical wives, grieving mothers, and dying old men.
It's not just a beverage, you know.
Yeah.
In that chaos, it's a profound, grounding psychological anchor.
It's maternal care weaponized against despair.
Exactly. In a world where water was often contaminated and alcohol was the primary coping mechanism, a cup of boiled tea was an astonishing gesture of stability.
But the defining moment for this young missionary wasn't just observing the tea, right?
No, it was a sudden biological crisis.
Right.
A woman in the court contracts the black fever, the plague.
Oh.
The terror is absolute. No one in the tenement will go near her. The missionary sees the paralysis, steps in, physically picks the highly contagious dying woman up in his arms, carries her down the rotting stairs, places her on a stretcher, and hauls her to the workhouse.
And when he walks back into Paradise Court after doing that, the entire social dynamic has inverted.
Completely.
The crowd is staring at him with deep respect. He didn't hand them a tract. He risked his own life.
Action over words.
And he is incredibly strategic. He instantly leverages that respect. He climbs onto a fishmonger's barrow, but he doesn't start giving a theological sermon.
What does he do?
He preaches public health. He yells at the crowd that the plague thrives in stale air and filth. He orders them to scrub their rooms, to buy whitewash for the walls, to clean out their stagnant water butts.
He's acting like a public health official.
Yeah. And then he demands what seems impossible in that culture, a sober Saturday night.
Which introduces us to the reality of drunken Sammy.
Oh, boy. Sam.
Sammy was the court's resident clown. He was a severe alcoholic whose public antics masked a deeply violent past.
Right.
The women of Paradise Court are so motivated by the missionaries' intervention that they actually enforce the sober Saturday night.
How do they do that?
They physically grab Sammy, drag him into his room, and lock the door from the outside. They leave him there for the entire weekend.
Wow.
It is a community-enforced cold turkey detox.
That is brutal. Before any modern medical understanding of withdrawal, they just lock him in a box?
The psychological agony for Sammy was immense. Alcohol was his chemical shield.
Shielding him from what?
Well, without it, the memories he had been suppressing hit him with full force. He had previously beaten his wife to death.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, he had managed to get acquitted in a court of law, but he knew he was guilty, and the reality of that guilt was destroying his mind.
That's heavy.
So by Sunday morning, he is sitting in this locked room, listening to the church bells ring across the city, plunging into absolute suicidal despair.
And then
the key turns in the lock.
And it's Widow Peters with the teapot.
Of course it is.
She doesn't preach at him. She pours him a cup of tea, pulls a few sugar knobs out of her pocket, and just lets the man weep.
She provides presents.
Yeah, he confesses to her that he killed his wife. She doesn't recoil. She simply tells him that forgiveness exists.
Meanwhile, the young missionary hasn't just been relying on the locals. He has gone and tracked down the parochial officer of health and dragged him into Paradise Court.
And the official is floored, right?
Oh, completely. The alleyways are washed. The doorways are glowing with fresh whitewash.
The official realizes that this untrained street preacher has achieved more behavioral change regarding public hygiene in a week than the government has in years.
Because behavioral change requires trust, not just legislation.
That's a great point.
Prompted by the visible effort of the residents, the health officer actually upgrades their drainage and water supply.
It worked.
And wealthy donors, here in the missionaries' reports, anonymously pay Widow Peters' rent and send food.
The anatomy of the suffering in Paradise Court shifted fundamentally. The residents realized that their physical survival actually mattered to someone outside the slums.
Exactly. Once that physical trust was secured, the psychological barriers dropped.
Because they felt they had a future. People who had lived together informally for decades suddenly started asking the missionary to officiate their weddings.
Right, they wanted to formalize their lives.
But the laymen couldn't fix everything with whitewash and tea.
No, they couldn't.
As they dug deeper into the slums, they hit a wall of systemic abuse that required a totally different kind of power to solve.
You're talking about the children.
I want to talk about the children. The sources lay out these realities that are genuinely difficult to process.
They are heartbreaking.
You have kids like Charlie Bin. He was a baby, found abandoned in a dustbin, adopted by a chimney sweep. By the time he was 6 years old, he was being forced to climb up inside burning hot chimneys.
And if they hesitated?
Yeah, when he hesitated, they would stick pins into the soles of his feet to force him upward. He died of soot cancer. It's just awful.
Then you have Mary Bundle, an orphan who was beaten so savagely by her supposed caregiver that she actually fled back to the workhouse covered in welts.
And we really have to pause and explain what the workhouse actually was to understand the horror of that.
Right, because it wasn't a charity hospital.
No, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act established the union workhouse system based on the principle of less eligibility.
What did that mean?
It means the government deliberately designed workhouses to be punitive. The conditions, the food, and the labor inside the workhouse were engineered to be worse than the lowest paying, most miserable job on the outside.
So they were trying to scare people away from public assistance.
Exactly. The goal was to deter anyone from seeking public help unless they were literally starving to death.
So for a child like Mary Bundle to run toward a workhouse means the abuse she was suffering at home was worse than institutionalized starvation.
It's unfathomable, and the pipeline from that abuse to the criminal justice system was instantaneous.
Like Thomas Miller. Right. The records show that by the time Thomas Miller was 12 years old, he was 4 feet 2 inches tall, and he had already been imprisoned and whipped more than 10 times for stealing food to survive.
10 times by age 12. It is a cycle of generational systemic trauma with zero safety net.
The missionaries were meticulously documenting this trauma. They were gathering the raw data of the slums, and occasionally they tried to intervene directly in the systemic madness.
Tell me about Higgers.
So there's the account of Higgers, a massive omnibus worker. He was a severe alcoholic who beat his wife so brutally and so often that it literally drove her insane.
Driven insane by abuse?
Yes. In a state of total psychotic break, she tried to drown their 3 children in the Regent's Canal. She is arrested and locked up in an asylum at Her Majesty's pleasure, which meant she was held indefinitely with no release date.
Leaving the kids deeply traumatized.
Exactly.
So the local missionary decides to go after the root cause. He kicks the door open, walks up to Higgers, who is a giant of a man and could easily kill him, points a finger in his face, and tells him that he is effectively a murderer.
Just confronts him head on.
He tells Higgers he will answer to the judgment seat of God for destroying his wife's mind.
The audacity of that confrontation is what makes it work. Higgers' psychological defense mechanisms shatter. He breaks down weeping.
And the missionary steps right into that gap.
Right. He capitalizes on the moment, forces Higgers to sign a temperance pledge, helps him restructure his disastrous finances, and ensures the children are cared for.
So Higgers gets clean.
He rehabilitates himself. But they hit a bureaucratic wall. They cannot get the wife out of the asylum.
Because a working-class missionary and a reformed omnibus driver have zero political leverage with the British legal system.
Zero.
This is where the narrative bridges the impossible class divide of 19th century London.
Because the missionary had been writing reports.
Yes. A wealthy philanthropist from Manchester reads the report about Higgers, and he happens to know Richard Cobden.
A highly influential member of Parliament.
Exactly. Cobden is intrigued, invites this street missionary to breakfast, listens to the entire saga, and then takes the case directly to Sir George Grey, the Home Secretary.
He goes straight to the top.
Grey orders a medical investigation into the wife's mental state. They find she has recovered her sanity, and a week later she is released and brought home in a hansom cab.
It is an incredible chain of command. You have a grassroots worker navigating from a filthy tenement floor directly into the library of the House of Commons to free a woman from a psychiatric prison.
But the ultimate realization of this top-down, bottom-up alliance is found in Lord Ashley, the Earl of Shaftesbury.
Oh, Lord Ashley.
Sure.
He is a fascinating psychological study.
How so?
Well, he is a high-ranking aristocrat, but his childhood was miserable. His parents were profoundly neglectful, and he was terrified and abused at his boarding school.
Wealthy, but totally abandoned.
Exactly. The only person in his entire world who showed him actual warmth was an old family servant named Maria Millis.
And she changed everything for him.
She did. She loved him, she taught him stories from the Bible, and when she died, she left him her gold watch. Lord Ashley wore that watch every day for the rest of his life.
That's beautiful.
Maria Millis is the key to Lord Ashley's worldview. Because of her, he developed a profound, ingrained respect for the working class and an intense empathy for abused children.
But he had a problem.
Right. He possessed the political power to enact systemic change in Parliament, but he lacked the physical access and the trust required to truly understand the slums. He didn't know how to reach the children.
Until 1843.
Yes, in 1843, he reads an advertisement for the Field Lane Ragged School, which is being run by an LCM missionary.
Just to anchor how appalling the specific school was, Charles Dickens actually visited the exact same Field Lane Ragged School.
And Dickens was horrified.
He was. Dickens wrote that the atmosphere was sickening and that it felt like all the deadly sins let loose. But Lord Ashley visits this chaos, and he watches men like missionary Roger Miller working with these feral kids.
And Ashley immediately recognizes the spirit of Maria Millis in them. He finds his people.
The symbiosis is perfect.
It really is.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the missionaries possessed the grassroots trust, and Lord Ashley possessed the legislative pen.
A perfect alliance.
Ashley used the unvarnished, authentic data provided by the missionaries to fight for monumental social reforms, like the 10-hour bill.
Which restricted child labor hours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to secure massive funding for the ragged schools. But the most stunning collaboration between the aristocracy and the street workers centers on a man named Thomas Jackson.
The thieves missionary.
Yes. Thomas Jackson is known as the thieves missionary of Whitechapel.
His background is a wild ride. He's an ex-Catholic who converted to Methodism, and the LCM drops him into a district completely dominated by Irish Roman Catholics, violent burglars, prostitutes, and fences who sell stolen goods.
It was not a safe place.
Not at all. When he first arrives, they test him constantly. They shove him, they beat him up. But Jackson is this large, imposing guy with a completely disarming, genial smile.
He doesn't back down.
He doesn't flinch. When they are wrong, he tells them straight to their faces, but crucially, he never reports them to the police. He operates by a strict code of silence.
He honors the street code.
Yeah. He starts quietly helping young pickpockets get out of the area and into trade schools.
And his adherence to that code earned him a level of trust that is almost hard to fathom.
Which leads to the letter.
Yes. It culminated in him receiving a round-robin letter. It was signed by about 40 hardened thieves and burglars.
What did they want?
They were writing to the missionary to ask for logistical advice on how to stop being criminals.
Wait, really? They wanted to quit.
Yeah, but the fundamental problem they faced was economic. The moment they stopped stealing, they would starve. Their criminal records locked them out of all legitimate employment.
So what does Jackson do?
Jackson reads this letter and takes it straight to Lord Ashley. And Ashley agrees to meet with them.
What happens next sounds like a summit between two rival mob families being mediated by a diplomat.
It's incredible.
They secure a hall. Jackson has actual ex-convicts working as bouncers at the doors. You literally cannot gain entry to this meeting unless you can prove to the bouncers that you have served a prison sentence.
Because they're terrified of police spies infiltrating the room.
Right. 350 hardened criminals gather inside. Jackson stands up and says, "His lordship wants to know the particular character of the men here. You who live by burglary, sit on the right, and the others on the left."
And what happens?
200 hardcore burglars just stand up and quietly move to the right side of the room.
The psychology of that moment is staggering.
It's mind-blowing.
These are men whose entire survival depends on secrecy and paranoia. Yet they're willingly categorizing their specific felonies in front of a wealthy member of the House of Lords.
What does it say about the desperation of these criminals that they would trust a man with a Bible and a wealthy lord over their own survival instincts?
It speaks to the absolute suffocating dead end of their existence. They knew this cycle of poverty, prison, and crime was a locked room they couldn't escape. When Lord Ashley stood up to address them, he didn't moralize or condescend. He spoke to them as equals.
There is pushback from the crowd, too. One thief stands up and says, "Prayer is very good, but it won't fill an empty stomach."
Which is very fair.
Right. And the whole room murmurs in agreement. It's practical reality. But then another man stands up and tells the room how Jackson had personally helped him endure near starvation for months, just so he could eventually secure honest work.
So the trust in Jackson validated Ashley.
Yes. And then the thieves pitch their ultimate question to Lord Ashley. Immigration. Could he get them out of London entirely? Could they start over in Canada or Australia?
Immigration was the only clean break from their criminal records. Lord Ashley asks them if they actually want him to return and help them, and they're desperate for him not to abandon them.
And he actually delivers.
He does. Ashley leaves that room and immediately uses his high society connections to head a subscription list. Within 3 months, 13 of those specific criminals are standing on the deck of a ship bound for Canada.
That is amazing.
Jackson, working with Ashley over the ensuing years, personally prepared nearly 200 thieves for emigration. As Jackson wrote, there was joy in thievedom. A tangible escape hatch had been built.
This top-down and bottom-up alliance didn't just stay in the dark corners of the criminal underworld. It became a cultural phenomenon that reshaped London's social fabric. As we move into the mid-19th century, philanthropy becomes fashionable.
It becomes a literal trend.
You have aristocrats intentionally driving their carriages through the slums just to be seen doing good works.
Yeah. Lord Ashley writes in his diary, with a heavy dose of irony, that humanity will soon be considered elegant, genteel.
You start seeing wealthy ladies in massive crinoline dresses showing up at the ragged schools. The missionaries, rather than rejecting this trend, harness it brilliantly.
How do they do that?
One missionary working near Berkeley Square observes that the local slum women don't even possess basic domestic skills. They don't know how to sew or mend clothes. So he creates a mothers' meeting.
Okay.
He recruits the ladies from the big houses to come down and teach them. The slum women pay 2 pennies a week into a collective fund. They learn to take discarded, wealthy garments and cut them down to fit their children, to make curtains, to mend tiers.
Which radically changes the physical environment of their homes.
Yeah.
But it also gives them a social outlet that isn't the local gym palace.
Exactly.
It was a vital social innovation for the women. However, the missionaries realized they were only reaching half the population.
Right. Where were the men?
The men were largely absent from these domestic initiatives. The men spent their wages and their free time in the public houses.
The pubs.
Yes. This realization triggered a massive tactical pivot for the London City Mission. They decided to break every unwritten rule of religious decorum and send missionaries directly into the pubs.
So what does this all mean? Going into pubs was taboo.
Oh, completely. The public houses were the centers of working-class male life, and sending a religious figure in there was considered deeply inappropriate.
So how did they start?
The first missionary only goes in because a woman is begging him to speak to her dying husband, who is currently propped up on 2 barrels in the middle of the bar.
Wow.
The missionary walks in, tries to talk to the man, and is immediately thrown out by the publican. But the dying man does find peace before he passes.
But there's a twist, right?
There is. The shocking twist is that when the publican himself falls ill sometime later, he specifically requests that the local rector come to the pubs so he can take communion.
Wow. The missionary's brief, disrespected visit had completely altered the publican's perspective.
That specific success proved the concept, and the LCM began officially assigning men to public house visitation. It was incredibly physical, grueling work.
I can imagine getting tossed out of bars.
Yeah, one young missionary recorded being physically thrown out of 3 different pubs in a single afternoon. The barman had a standardized technique: grab the collar, push the weight forward, kick the swinging doors open, and shove the missionary face first into the street.
That's rough. So what did they do?
The missionaries adapted. They learned how to read the room. They started using the bizarre names of the pubs as icebreakers.
It's like they became embedded journalists. They walk into a pub called the Man with a Load of Mischief or the Cat and Fiddle and use the sign on the door to start a joke or a conversation.
Exactly. And while they are in there, they aren't just preaching. They're observing the mechanics of the culture. They recognize that the completely unregulated all-night drinking hours are systematically destroying families and driving the poverty cycle.
And what do they do with those observations?
Their daily observations transformed into incredibly effective political data. By 1854, the government recognized the unique access the LCM had. The Home Secretary actually asked representatives of the London City Mission to give formal evidence to Parliament regarding London's nightlife.
Wow, they were testifying before Parliament.
Yes. Based directly on the missionaries' reports, they recommended forcing pubs to close at midnight and implementing strict licensing for all-night coffee houses. The government agreed, and a bill was passed that very session enacting those exact curfews.
Think about the magnitude of that. Grassroots street workers directly authoring and passing municipal zoning and licensing laws by utilizing their raw observational data.
It's incredible lobbying. And they didn't just target the pubs, they started targeting incredibly specific, isolated workforces.
Like the Kensington potteries.
Right. They send a guy into the Kensington potteries. This wasn't just pottery, it was a massive, stinking industrial zone where people bred pigs on a massive scale. The workers there were completely cut off from mainstream society.
And the missionary eventually gets a workman's hall built there. But my favorite specialized outreach is to the cabmen.
Oh, the cabbies.
The cabbies wait outside the railway stations all night in the freezing cold. The LCM needs someone who understands that specific grind. Who do they hire? An actual cabbie named Adams.
Adams was a legend on the ranks. He was known as the Saint because he adamantly refused to work his cab on Sundays.
So he knew the struggles firsthand.
He wasn't a theological scholar, but he possessed the exact sociological key required to unlock that community. He knew the brutal economics of the cab ranks, the theft, the reliance on alcohol to stay warm, the exhaustion.
Because he was an insider, his message carried weight. He convinced a massive number of cabbies to adopt his practices and refuse Sunday work.
This grassroots movement among the drivers gathered so much momentum that they successfully lobbied the government to create special 6-day working licenses, reducing their financial burden and giving them a mandated day of rest.
And Adams is so successful that he eventually emigrates to Australia and becomes a mayor.
Right, a mayor.
Yeah. The upward mobility generated by these interventions is staggering. As the 19th century closes, the LCM has over 450 missionaries embedded in every conceivable niche of London's industry. There is a palpable sense of triumph.
They genuinely believe they are mathematically conquering the squalor of the city.
But just as the LCM feels it is conquering the physical and social squalor of the 19th century, the 20th century arrives to shatter their optimistic worldview.
It was the zenith of the British Empire. There was a prevailing cultural optimism that science, industry, and coordinated philanthropy were on a continuous, unstoppable upward trajectory toward societal perfection.
But the sources use a very specific, chilling metaphor for what happens next. The 1912 sinking of the Titanic.
Right.
The Titanic wasn't destroyed by the small visible block of ice above the water. It was destroyed by the massive hidden iceberg lurking beneath the surface.
The hidden geopolitical tensions of Europe were the iceberg. And the outbreak of the First World War rips the optimistic worldview to shreds.
It must have been devastating.
For the LCM, the war isn't just a philosophical crisis. It's an immediate financial disaster. Donations vanish overnight. They are suddenly staring at a £5,000 overdraft.
£5,000 was a massive sum back then.
Massive. The committee has to make the brutal decision to cut every missionary's salary by 20%.
Ouch.
But in a beautiful display of local solidarity, curates and church members across the city quietly step up, passing the hat to make up the difference out of their own meager pockets so the missionaries don't starve.
But the psychological environment on the streets during the war became toxic. Patriotism was weaponized.
Very much so.
Able-bodied missionaries walking the streets in civilian clothes were despised. People would scream at them, demanding to know why they weren't dying in the trenches in France. They were constantly handed white feathers by strangers, the ultimate public symbol of cowardice.
Yet, amidst that immense public hostility, the sources reveal a bizarre alliance.
Wait, who allied with them?
In the East End, the only people who actively protect the missionaries are the prostitutes.
Wow. Why them?
Because the missionaries were the only ones publicly denouncing the men running illegal brothels. These violent pimps and human bloodhounds who were exploiting vulnerable girls while simultaneously dodging the military draft.
So they shared a common enemy?
Exactly. When angry crowds turned on the missionaries, the prostitutes actually formed physical barriers to defend them.
That is wild.
The First World War shattered the illusion of perpetual progress, and then the Second World War physically shattered the city itself through the Blitz.
And post-WWII London changes radically.
It does. It is the post-WWII reconstruction that fundamentally changes the nature of the LCM's work. The government implements the modern welfare state. The National Health Service is born.
Slum clearance.
Massive slum clearance programs replace the rotting tenements with concrete housing estates featuring indoor plumbing and central heating. State pensions are formalized.
So the raw biological destitution, the cholera, the starvation, the freezing to death that David Nasmith and Lindsay Burfoot fought was essentially eradicated.
Which brings us to the most complex transition in the anatomy of the city's suffering. The state fixed the biology, but in doing so, they engineered a psychological nightmare.
What's fascinating here is that the new architecture completely changed the social dynamic. In the old slums, you had to share a water pump, you shared privy, your doors opened onto a shared courtyard. You were forced into community just to survive.
But the new high-rises gave you a private bathroom and heating, but they put your front door in a sterile concrete corridor suspended in the sky.
It's like a reverse quarantine. Instead of keeping sickness out, they kept humanity isolated inside.
Yes.
If the government provides the bread and the medicine, what is the role of the missionary? Does comfort breed a different kind of desperation?
The disease of the city didn't die. It mutated. The suffering shifted from the physical agony of cholera to the crippling, silent agony of total isolation. To see exactly how this new kind of desperation played out, we have to look at the post-war missionaries who waded into the bizarre, specialized subcultures of modern London.
Who do the sources introduce us to?
They introduce us to post-war missionaries like Jimmy C. White. He was a tough, former Clydeside engineer who joined the LCM in 1948 and was deployed to Lambeth.
And what did he find there?
He spent his days climbing the echoey concrete stairs of these massive new high-rises, and the sheer loneliness he found behind those closed doors is devastating.
Jimmy meets a woman who tells him a story about Christmas morning. She woke up in her flat, and the isolation was so suffocating that she said she would have gladly invited the dirtiest, most destitute tramp in London inside just to have another human being in the room.
But nobody knocked.
So she took 13 pounds and went down to the local pub and spent 11 pounds buying drinks for strangers, coming home with only 2 pounds left just to hear another human voice acknowledge her existence for an hour.
That is just heartbreaking.
Jimmy also meets a young gay Scottish drug addict who is prostituting himself at the major train stations. The kid is sobbing, saying he just wants to be in decent company. Jimmy brings him home, feeds him, secures him a job, but the kid's trauma is too deep, and he vanishes back into the underground.
The grind of this apathy is relentless. To prevent burnout, Jimmy is eventually transferred to a completely different environment, the Smithfield meat market.
How is that different?
If Lambeth was silent isolation, Smithfield was a deafening, hypermasculine, violently tough micro-society. The men haul massive carcasses of meat all night. The language is entirely composed of obscenities.
Tough crowd.
Very. When Jimmy first arrives, the market manager introduces him to the floor as a welfare worker. Jimmy is deeply offended. He views himself as a preacher of the gospel, not a secular social worker.
But he has an epiphany.
Right. As he reflects on a verse in the book of Nehemiah about a man coming to seek the welfare of Israel, he realizes that addressing their physical, emotional, and social welfare is the prerequisite to any spiritual conversation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Smithfield is basically a closed fraternity. The obscenity isn't just vulgarity, it's security perimeter. You have to prove you won't break to be allowed inside. Jimmy is walking the market floors, handing out magazines, getting cursed out relentlessly. He approaches a massive butcher known as Big Fred. Big Fred pulls a 15-inch razor-sharp carving knife on Jimmy, aims it at him, and tells him to get lost using a string of extreme profanity.
Jimmy reads the situation, doesn't panic, but wisely backs off.
But a few weeks later, Jimmy hears through the grapevine that Big Fred has fallen ill. So Jimmy finds out where Fred lives in North London, goes to his house, and knocks on the front door.
Big Fred answers the door and is completely speechless. He asks, "What do you want?" Jimmy simply says, "I heard you were ill. I came to see how you are."
Wow.
Fred, completely disarmed, invites him in for a cup of tea. For 2 solid hours, Fred just talks. He talks about his physical pain, his stress at the market, his family. Jimmy barely says a single word. He just listens.
Why did Jimmy's simple, sick visit to Fred succeed where theological arguments would have instantly failed?
Because Jimmy subverted all the sociological expectations. The obscenity and the knife were just a shield. Underneath all that aggression, Big Fred was just a guy who wanted someone to notice that he was vulnerable and in pain.
And the market sees the change.
When Fred recovers and returns to the meat market, he throws his massive arm around Jimmy, glares at the other butchers, and screams, "When I was ill, not one of you came to see me, only the missionary. If you have anything to say to him, you say it to me first."
Fred later takes Jimmy out for coffee and admits something profound. He says that when he was tucking his daughter into bed, he said, "God bless you." And he suddenly realized the cognitive dissonance of invoking a God he aggressively claimed didn't exist.
He started questioning his own atheism, not because Jimmy debated him with theology, but purely because Jimmy had modeled unconditional care by showing up at his house.
Jimmy's concept of welfare work extended into highly complex, practical administrative interventions. Tell me about Aeroplane Harry.
Aeroplane Harry. He literally flies his own small plane. Harry and his wife are suffering deeply because they are infertile. They are desperate for a child, but the formal adoption agencies have rejected them, classifying them as too old.
So Jimmy steps in.
Jimmy sees the psychological toll this is taking. He leverages his massive nationwide network of Christian contacts and miraculously locates a foster mother in Dawlish looking to place a child.
Did it work out?
Yes. Harry and his wife successfully adopt a little boy named Ian, and later a second boy named Anthony. Through the deeply practical administrative slog of facilitating an adoption, Harry and his wife's entire worldview shifts, and they find their way back to a vibrant faith.
So Jimmy White is operating deep inside the specific rules of the meat market subculture. Meanwhile, over in Covent Garden, another missionary is dealing with a totally different demographic.
Lionel Ball.
We have Lionel Ball. He's a musical Welshman who has been playing the mouth organ for Penny since he was a toddler. He is put in charge of the London Medical Mission building, which is ironic because it hasn't functioned as an actual medical facility in years.
But then he gets a phone call.
He gets a phone call from a Christian medical student studying at Guy's Hospital. His name is Sandy Millar, and he wants to use the building to reach the massive population of young drug addicts drifting through Soho and Piccadilly.
The West End in the early 1970s was the dark undertow of the 1960s permissive society. You had waves of teenage runaways pouring into London, leading to severe drug addiction and prostitution.
It was deadly.
The mortality rate was shocking. Lionel recorded a conversation with a local nightclub owner who casually mentioned he had recently attended 14 funerals of young people from the area.
14 funerals! That's devastating.
To penetrate this culture, Lionel and Sandy Millar developed the Thursday night fish and chip strategy. They don't wait in the building. They go out into Leicester Square and the dark alleys of Soho, find these kids, and invite them back to the mission for free hot food and coffee.
And they realize instantly that traditional religious architecture is a massive psychological barrier. A runaway heavily addicted to heroin is not going to walk into a building with stained glass, sit quietly in a wooden pew, and listen to a sermon.
No, not at all.
So Lionel and Sandy strip the religious aesthetics away. They set up basic tables and folding chairs. They serve coffee in mismatched mugs. Lionel sits at an old piano and plays popular music. They create a completely neutral ground.
And it worked.
The first night they try this, 8 kids show up. The following week, word has spread on the street and 60 kids pack the room. They are reaching a demographic that mainstream society has completely written off.
Like Mick.
Yeah, they meet guys like Mick, an ex-convict who carries a deep, violent hatred for the police, who eventually undergoes such a transformation that he goes to the local station to make peace with the officers.
But the sources are unflinching about the psychological barriers of the late 20th century. Bypassing the architecture didn't guarantee success. The stakes were absolute life and death, and they lost people.
They really did.
Lionel interacts with a 14-year-old girl who casually mentions she had been put on the contraceptive pill by her state care worker when she was 13 and is currently suffering from venereal disease.
Just a child.
When Lionel tries to intervene, she flatly tells him that she enjoys her lifestyle and sees zero reason to alter it. There's another tragic case of a 19-year-old girl who had run away at age 14 to marry a gypsy.
What happened to her?
Just weeks after Lionel and Sandy speak with her and try to get her help, she's found dead in a derelict abandoned house. The sheer volume of the tragedy was overwhelming.
And while Lionel and Jimmy were digging deep into highly localized subcultures, other workers were dealing with the sheer overwhelming volume of the global city.
London had evolved into a massive global crossroads. The entire world was flowing through the city.
Which brings us to the epicenter of global tourism, Trafalgar Square. The LCM deploys a man named Peter Schaub there.
Peter Schaub is fascinating.
His background is he's German, found his faith in Hamburg, and trained in the Swiss Midnight Mission. But his operational strategy in Trafalgar Square seems completely insane.
Because he doesn't have a neighborhood.
Exactly. His territory is a transient, churning crowd of millions of strangers. So he relies entirely on spiritual intuition. He sits quietly inside the church of St. Martin in the Fields, prays, and simply waits until he feels an undeniable urge to walk outside and speak to one specific person in the crowd.
From a sociological perspective, it sounds like an incredibly inefficient, chaotic method, but the results yielded stunning cross-cultural connections.
Give me an example.
Peter walks up to two random African Catholic students who are studying to become priests. He strikes up a relationship that eventually grants him access to their International Hall of Residence for over a decade, allowing him to counsel students from across the globe.
That's incredible.
He engages a young Israeli student named Baruch, who was studying to become a rabbi. They engage in fierce theological debates for months before Baruch returns to Tel Aviv.
And then what?
Years later, Peter is walking through Trafalgar Square, and Baruch suddenly comes running across the pavement shouting, "Brother Peter, I have found the Messiah."
The ripple effects of these momentary encounters are wild. Peter stops a West Indian man on Oxford Street, talks to him briefly about faith, and throws in a random practical comment. And you need to wash your shirt.
Just completely out of nowhere.
4 years later, that same man spots Peter, walks up to him, and says that the random comment about his dirty shirt stuck in his head for years, completely changing his trajectory. The guy is now living in Dublin, running a ministry for drug addicts. Is street evangelism essentially a numbers game? Or is there an unexplainable intuition at play, like Peter sitting in the church waiting for a target?
For Peter and the LCM, it was unequivocally the latter. They operated on the belief that they were being divinely appointed to intersect with specific individuals at precise moments of vulnerability.
They started recruiting internationally, right?
Yes. As London globalized, the LCM actively recruited international workers to bridge the communication gaps. They brought over Valio Siriala from Finland.
Did he struggle with the language?
Valio is deeply insecure about his heavy accent and struggles immensely with learning English to the point where he doubts his calling. Yet the very first person he successfully leads to faith is a deeply lonely Japanese student named Mobu. Modu subsequently moves to Finland for Bible college, marries a Finnish woman, and returns to Japan to establish his own mission. The global web of connectivity that started on the pavement of London is staggering.
We also see the LCM utilizing specific cultural backgrounds to diffuse local tensions. Enter Simeon Damdar.
Oh, Damdar is brilliant.
He is an accountant from Guyana. He receives a profound sense of calling at a conference in 1965, but doesn't actually transition into the LCM until 1977. They place him in Lewisham, South London, and he possesses this incredibly sharp, disarming wit.
Which he needed.
This is crucial because the National Front, a far-right, white nationalist political group, is becoming highly active in his neighborhood. The racial tension is a powder keg. One day, Damdar walks into his youth club, and someone has aggressively carved the letters NF into one of the wooden chairs.
It was a direct, calculated threat. The local boys are watching him intently, waiting to see how this Guyanese missionary will react to blatant racial intimidation.
And what does he do?
Damdar doesn't get angry. He doesn't lecture them. He looks at the carved letters, beams a massive, genuine smile, and says, "Why, I didn't know you backed the same football club as me. Nottingham Forest. NF."
That is genius.
The tension in the room instantly shatters. The boys burst out laughing. By deploying humor instead of outrage, He completely de-escalated a potentially violent racial confrontation while simultaneously maintaining his authority and earning their deep respect.
He was a master of human connection. He visits a local hospital and is accidentally mistaken for a doctor by a patient named Albert, who has just suffered a massive heart attack.
And he plays along.
Damdar leans over the bed and simply quotes John 3:16, but he inserts Albert's name directly into the verse. God so loved Albert. And Albert starts weeping, revealing that he had recently dug up a rusted iron plaque in his garden that had those exact words printed on it.
The timing is unbelievable.
Or you have Mrs. Off, a reformed alcoholic living in an old people's home. She doesn't preach, but her mere quiet presence in room allows Damdar to comfort a dying woman. The invisible building of living stones is everywhere.
But perhaps the most extreme example of the LCM utilizing a dark past as a credential to reach an unreachable demographic is the story of Brian Greenaway.
Tell me about Brian Greenaway.
Greenaway was the president of a notorious Hells Angels chapter. His childhood was marked by severe brutality. He harbored terrifying anger issues, and he was currently sitting in Dartmoor prison serving his third sentence.
So he's hardened.
Completely. While in his cell, he reads a book called Run, Baby, Run by Nicky Cruz, who was a former violent gang leader in New York. Greenaway recognizes his own rage and despair in Cruz's story.
And it hits him.
He prays for the same psychological deliverance Cruz experienced and undergoes a profound, immediate conversion.
Greenaway gets out of prison, spends time rehabilitating in a Christian center, and applies to the LCM. Because of his background, he asks for the toughest assignment they have. They send him to the Isle of Dogs in the East End.
But the environment traumatizes him in a way violence never did.
How so?
He walks down the street and sees toddlers playing in the gutter with jagged, broken glass, while their mothers lean against the walls, watching them with total blank indifference. He realizes that the suffocating spiritual apathy of the modern East End is completely breaking his spirit.
So he pivots. He decides to return to the only environment he truly understands. He becomes a dedicated prison missionary.
Greenaway's dark past transformed into his greatest asset. When the prison warders sneered at him, or the hardened inmates tried to intimidate him, he didn't flinch because he had been the apex predator in that exact environment.
He had absolute credibility.
He spoke their highly specific language. He understood the terrifying psychology of leaving the highly structured, predictable environment of a prison cell and facing the overwhelming, indifferent chaos of the civilian streets. He could offer the inmates a genuine, credible lifeline because he had successfully climbed that exact same rope out of the darkness himself.
But even as these incredible redemptive stories are playing out in the prisons and the tourist squares, a new, chilling atmosphere is settling over the everyday residential streets of London.
We move into the contemporary crisis.
Right. The post-war era of open doors, where neighbors popped in for sugar, is dead. Now the doors are dead-bolted and chained. Inside, the television is always on, creating a deafening, constant wall of electronic distraction.
People have material comfort. The welfare state ensures they won't starve. But they are completely, terrifyingly apathetic to anything beyond their immediate entertainment.
And running parallel to that apathy is the emergence of a new kind of terror, casual, senseless urban violence.
The sources document a distinct shift from the 19th century crime, which was driven by the desperation of starvation, to a late 20th century violence born out of sheer boredom and societal breakdown.
You have teenagers stealing cars for high-speed joyrides, 14-year-olds aggressively drinking on the pavement outside the mission halls, and a pervasive, paralyzing fear among the elderly population of being violently mugged just walking home with their groceries in broad daylight.
We see this play out with John Taylor. He is placed in West Croydon, right in the middle of a massive new housing estate.
What happens to him?
He tries to establish a traditional youth club, but the kids are completely uncontrollable. They have no respect for authority. If he threatens them, they just laugh in his face because they know the modern legal system protects them from any physical discipline.
So he's powerless.
They vandalize his property. They drink on his doorstep. His entire mission in Croydon only survives because of two local women, Shirley and Pat, who constantly support him.
But it's exhausting.
The daily harassment is a war of attrition. Taylor eventually burns out completely and has to request a transfer to Clapham Park, where he shifts his focus to working with single-parent families.
This raises an important question, right? Because Taylor's burnout highlights the profound paradox of modern urban planning.
It does. Following the wars, city planners genuinely believed that building these secure, self-contained concrete estates would keep people safe and comfortable.
But in demolishing the old, cramped, terraced streets, we destroy the organic, interconnected community.
We remove the shared physical struggles, like fetching coal or sharing a wash house, that force neighbors to interact and rely on one another.
The total breakdown of local communal accountability turned those very architectural fortresses into incubators for isolation, unmonitored crime, and deep fear.
We see Keith Griffiths working in Hackney, spending the majority of his time not preaching, but physically escorting terrified elderly women to the shops to protect them from roaming teenagers. The mood of the city fundamentally shifted from mere indifference to outright despair for the future.
It's exactly like a modern housing estate became a medieval fortress under siege, but the attack is coming from within. You double lock your door, but the threat is living in the flat directly above you.
This is terrifying.
Is the fear of a random, senseless mugging by a bored teenager actually harder for a missionary to combat than the 19th century fear of a cholera outbreak?
Cholera was a tangible external enemy. You could fight it with buckets of whitewash, clean water, and boiling a teapot.
But how do you fight the internal psychological decay of a community that has a refrigerator full of food and central heating, but absolutely no reason to care if their neighbor lives or dies?
That is the ultimate defining challenge of the modern metropolis. In the 19th century, the missionaries offered the immediate, tangible gift of physical survival, inextricably intertwined with spiritual hope.
Today, physical survival is largely managed by a vast, impersonal state bureaucracy.
This leaves the missionaries battling a profound, invisible crisis of meaning. When a society is materially sustained, but spiritually and communally bankrupt, the resulting violence, addiction, and despair are incredibly resistant to simple programmatic solutions.
And that brings us full circle on this massive 150-year journey through the source material. We started in the mud of the 1830s with David Nasmith's ragged, working-class laymen fighting literal plagues with whitewash and enforcing sober Saturdays to stop murder.
We saw them build impossible political bridges with aristocrats like Lord Ashley to rescue abused chimney sweeps and export hardened thieves to a new life.
We watched them survive the trauma of the world wars, adapt to the sweeping changes of the welfare state, and then wade into the dark, lonely corners of high-rise flats, the drug addiction of Soho, and the casual terror of the modern housing estate.
Through all of those wildly different eras, the specific methodology constantly evolved, but the core mandate never wavered.
It was always about presence.
Whether it was Lindsay Burfoot physically carrying a highly contagious plague victim down the stairs to the workhouse, Jimmy White sitting in silence in Big Fred's kitchen for 2 hours, or Sandy Millar handing out hot fish and chips in a neutral room in Soho, the constant was relentless, personal, physical presence.
And that is the core lesson for you, the listener. Think about your own life, whether you are managing a massive team in a corporate office, trying to build a local community organization, or just striving to be a decent neighbor in a modern, isolated city. Genuine, messy human involvement is totally irreplaceable.
Bureaucracy only goes so far.
Exactly. A massive government bureaucracy can fix your plumbing, upgrade the electrical grid, and deposit your pension check. But it takes a human being to sit next to a dying man propped up on a barrel in a pub, or to invite a hostile homeless teenager into a warm room for a cup of coffee.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
Okay.
Today we spend billions of dollars engineering smart cities. We use complex AI to optimize traffic lights, we upgrade the utility grids for maximum efficiency, and we install countless high-definition cameras in the name of security.
We want to automate safety.
But what if the ultimate, most essential urban infrastructure isn't made of fiber optic cables or reinforced concrete at all? What if a city's actual survival depends entirely on those invisible buildings made of living stones? People who are simply willing to knock on a chained, dead-bolted door just to ask if the person inside is okay.